we're going to look at a few ways both the meaning and the means of currency is transferring value and changing through these innovative thinkers. And the first up is Rachel Cook, who's going to be interviewed by Jon Chang. Rachel's looking at the disparity and how we might move currency around the world to boost people. She's got an innovative way to do this with games and microfinance. She's going to be interviewed by Jon Chang, who is the marketer of Pricing Engine and has his own experience with microfinance, having worked in Bangladesh for a month. He did not see such a great experience as we talked about it. The distribution system was a little off. Women would get a loan, men would then take the money and then spend it on non-entrepreneurial things. So he's got a different point of view, but he still believes in it. And Rachel is a former equities trader who also left equity trading to work on an arts project, the microlending film project, which took her amongst 4 other countries in the world to Kenya, where she saw the M-Pesa system. And if you don't know about the M-Pesa system, it's kind of fascinating. It's a mobile to mobile money transfer. So you don't have to go to the bank. They're kind of skipping right over a credit card. So they're actually ahead of us in kind of digital money. So she started this company that's looking at how to transfer value from us to people who need it, and she's going to do that through the gaming industry. So she's pairing gaming and microfinance, and she's just about to incorporate her API into Knights and Dragons. Now, Rachel's also a Second City stand-up, so she ought to be able to tell a story well. She said it really helped in pitching, so let's hear Rachel and Jon.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. So we'll, yes, be talking about microfinance and gamification. A lot of this does require some sort of background. I'm just wondering how many people in here have a base knowledge or can identify the definition of microfinance. All right, so there's a decent portion. I'm just wondering, would you like to give, I guess, a micro crash course?
Yes, I would love to do that. So microloans are tiny loans, generally $25 or even smaller, that are most often lent to women in developing countries because these women are left outside of the formal economies in these countries. And $25 is a significant amount of money to them, so they can use this capital to fund entrepreneurial initiatives. And the loans are repaid at extremely high rates, like 98%, depending on the region in the country or region of the world. So it's a great way to empower these female entrepreneurs without using charity. It's a sustainable method.
Awesome. So you have kind of an interesting story that Deidre pointed out. You went from being a trader to being in Second City. I'm just wondering, what are the steps that led up to what you're doing now, and are there any more influential moments that you can recall?
Sure. So I went to Duke for undergrad. I grew up in a farm town in Ohio with 1,000 people there. And I knew that I wanted to do something in the arts, something with writing, and I had spent some time in LA in college and realized that I hated LA. No offense to anyone in here who loves Los Angeles. So I knew that a lot of the comedy writers that I sort of idolized had gone through Second City, which was in Chicago. Like Bill Murray, Tina Fey, Chris Farley, virtually a lot of people you can think of that were on SNL had gone through Second City. So it seemed like more of a clear path. So I went to Chicago. I worked as a trader while trying to get things staged at Second City. Probably my most notable sketch was a sketch called Mime Brothel, about a brothel full of mimes. And it was cool. I mean, it was well reviewed. And it was, the critics in Chicago liked it, but, on a good night, 30 people would come and see the show, and that was it, So there was that coupled with my experience in the trading world, in which I was making more money than I expected to in my early 20s, but I was always the only woman or one of the only women in these weird environments where people would just watch porn during the day. And so I think those two things combined, along with my interest in film and the arts, made me attracted to something that could help women, that was also a good investment because that appealed to the trader in me. And so I decided to make this film about the impact of microloans on women. And that's when the microlending film project was born. And as Deirdre said, that took us around the world. We shot on 4 continents, and when we were in Kenya, it was just amazing to see that people that lived in literally sheet metal houses in the slums, Kibera, which is the world's second largest slum, with 800,000 residents, is like smack dab in the middle of Nairobi. And people could go out and buy produce at roadside stands and text message the payment and leave with the produce. So I think I went in with some very just misguided notions about what sub-Saharan Africa would be like. I certainly didn't expect to see that it was this amazing technology that wasn't happening here was taking place in Kenya. So after filming there, I came back to the States and thought about other industries that I could connect to. And I found out that women benefit from these loans. Women also make these loans on web-based platforms like Kiva. And women play social games. So if you're playing a game, if you're looking at a game like Farmville, the average social gamer is a 43-year-old woman in a red state, 2 kids, some college. She comes home from work and she plays Farmville to kind of like unwind at the end of the day. So it just seemed like that was counterintuitive because I assumed that the people playing these games are teenage boys, but they aren't. So this demographic overlap seemed to offer a lot of possibilities, and that's how Seeds was born. So Seeds is all about embedding things embedding an API, an application programming interface, in as many games as possible so that we can allow gamers to make microloans directly to the cell phones of entrepreneurs in places like Kenya through the game.
Yeah, I mean, you want to step a little more into the process. Like, how does a user, like your general demographic, use this, and then how do the funds get transferred to the entrepreneurs, and what do they do with it? Sure,
yeah, so gaming, if you're looking at the way games are monetized, gaming is a gigantic industry. It's crazy. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And companies like Zynga, which is the company that made Farmville, which has kind of fallen off in the last couple years, still makes over $300 million in revenue a quarter. And the reason they're able to pull money through their system is it's 4-pronged, I guess you could say. The first thing that they do is they monetize impatience. So if you're growing crops on your Farmville farm, you can pay to instantly, make your corn grow or whatever. Like, you can wait a certain amount of time in real time, or you can pay for it to happen instantly. And you're paying for that in virtual currency, but you can purchase the virtual currency with real currency. And it's usually tiny increments. It's $1 or maybe a little bit more. So in that way, they just generate hundreds of millions of dollars a quarter. So yeah, so it's monetizing impatience, and then it's also selling decorators and virtual goods. So an example would be like a pink tractor in Farmville that's only available until Valentine's Day. It's limited edition. And you pay 5 Farmville dollars, I can't remember what their currency is, to get the tractor, but that costs 50 cents or something like that. And people do this. People spend a ton of money decorating these virtual worlds. And then the third is ad sales. And the fourth that we're working with is actively soliciting microloans through the games. Yeah.
All right, how many people here have played Farmville or other games like it? I've played Dragonvale, and it seems ridiculous to actually pay money to expedite the process. I'd much rather wait the 16 hours and pay $5. So and for me playing the game, I've always seen, after hearing you describe Seeds, to me it seems like there's two very different worlds that are being connected. Like, there's the investment and the actual social good of the entrepreneurs, but then the end users, the people that are playing in the game. And how are you bridging these two very different worlds?
Sure. So we looked at it from a behavioral psychology standpoint. It was really important to not in any way seem self-righteous or make people feel like, hey, you should be making these loans because you're a rich first worlder who's frivolously spending your money on this virtual crap. Instead, we just wanted to embed it within the game so that it was functioning with behavior that people were already habitually doing within the context of the game. So that might mean, in the case of the prototype that we built, when you're monetizing impatience, if somebody wants to instantly build a level in a tower that they're building in Tiny Tower, if you're playing Tiny Tower, a casual game that I have on my phone, instead of waiting 3 hours in real time for the floor to be completed, you can choose to make 3 microloans, $1 each, to different types of micro businesses. So it's just kind of inserting the option to microlend within the behavior that's already happening in the gaming structure. And yeah, it's working.
Yeah?
Yeah, and our prototype, which we built just to confirm these assumptions about user behavior, did confirm those assumptions. So yeah, it addresses certain issues, a couple issues on both sides, on the microlending and on the gaming side, and that people act like playing games like Farmville is a huge waste of time. but 3 billion hours per week globally are spent playing games. So it's just like, if we harness that in any way, if we harnessed it in for-profit, channeling some of it into for-profit microfinance, it's a huge resource, and it's just silly to relegate that to leisure whenever it could be harnessed for something better. And then on the microlending side, the issue of donor fatigue is addressed because people like giving to charities, but they only like doing so up to a point, and then they start to feel like they've been tapped out. But if the charity aspect, even though this isn't a charity because it's a interest-generating loan, if it's embedded in a game that you enjoy playing anyway, donor fatigue also isn't an issue. Mm-hmm. So it's not intuitive, but it does make sense when you break it down.
Mm-hmm. And as far as donor fatigue goes, one thing we had talked about previous to this is when the earthquake happened in Haiti, a lot of press, people are very interested in the cause. I mean, I even had people from my high school reach out. They were selling baked goods. They were doing X, Y, and Z. But soon after, it seemed like everyone forgot about it. There's a cholera outbreak. The UN came in. It wasn't a stable community yet, but people had forgotten about it. I don't really see this happening with microfinance. Do you?
Yeah, I don't see it happening with microfinance because I think the Haiti example is awesome because it shows, like Farmville, Zynga did this, they created this opportunity for Farmville players to donate money to schools in Haiti, to rebuild schools in Haiti after the earthquake by selling virtual barley. So Farmville players bought virtual barley. I think they raised something like $4 million in a week that went directly to rebuilding Haitian schools. So the thing about that, though, is that it was like an emotionally charged moment, and then people, the next event happened, another crisis elsewhere in the world, and people, yeah, like you said, kind of forgot. Yeah. Whereas with microfinance, microlending specifically, you're getting constant, tiny repayments, and so you continue to be engaged, and you're getting something back, so you can continue to relend it.
Mm-hmm. So what's your end goal with this project?
World domination. I think we can totally. I think there's enormous potential in this idea. I mean, people have talked a lot about gamification, and it's been kind of a trendy, whatever, catchphrase, maybe like 6 months ago or something. But there's just a lot of potential in harnessing fun, in harnessing behaviors that people want to do anyway, that they enjoy doing for-profit reinvestment and social good. And these women, they can't get loans. They can't go to a bank. They don't have collateral. So this allows them to access capital that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access.
Totally. So it seems like this is something that a lot of people play, adjustable market, and a big part of what you're doing, and it goes along with your great news today, is that you're an open API to be built with other games. Mm-hmm. So how does that scale? Is it going well?
Sure. So we had big news on Monday in that Gree, which is this Japanese gaming giant, maybe some of you are familiar, 200 million plus users, and they rival Zynga in size, and they're moving into the US. They agreed, as Deirdre mentioned, to allow us to embed the Seeds API in Knights and Dragons, which is a new mobile release of theirs. So that by itself, if we execute in the way that we have to, makes our business. So it's just, rather than having to spend X amount of dollars on user acquisition, to get a single person to start playing a game that we built, instead our business model is to embed our API in partner games and then immediately access hopefully millions of users with a single partnership. So, I mean, it's attractive to the gaming partners because we can give them a cut of the interest. And we can even give them a cut of the principal on the loans if we have to make the deal worthwhile to them, because the loans are repaid to the gamers in virtual currency. And we've conducted focus groups to make sure that no gamers feel like their toes are being stepped on because we're repaying the loans in virtual currency. But it's okay. It works because the assumption gamers have is that as soon as they put real money into a gaming system, it just stays in that system, with the exception of a couple games like Second Life, in which you can pull some money out. Yeah, so it's just partnerships, and it's helpful to the gaming companies, especially smaller gaming companies, because they need additional revenue streams. And they can also say, hey, we care about social good because we're embedding the Seeds API.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I am really interested in more of the work you've done in Nairobi. Mm-hmm. You have this crazy story that I just love hearing. You mind sharing it?
Sure. This might leave the wrong impression, that it might make Kenya sound less secure than I want you guys to think that it is. I mean, it's secure, and they're doing things with mobile money transfer, like Deirdre had mentioned, that aren't happening anywhere else in the world. But yeah, last summer when we were there working on seats on the ground and implementing the prototype, I was with an American friend, this white kid from Iowa, in a car. and we wanted to see a witch doctor, which isn't illegal, I promise. And you have no idea where the story is going, right? So we were talking to the witch doctor, and then these cops with like AK-47s, plainclothes cops, came around a corner and just like took the driver, made our driver get in their car, and just drove us away and didn't tell us what was going on. We were just like, shit, we're getting like hijacked. And we ended up spending the night in a Kenyan jail, which is exactly like what you might imagine a Kenyan jail would be like. It was like a dungeon with like this like small window and like a hole in the floor for a latrine. Luckily, none of the inmates tried to mess with us or anything. Yeah, and it just turned out, I guess we were in the wrong place at the wrong time, because there'd been Al-Shabaab, the Somali insurgent group that's associated with Al-Qaeda, something had happened in the area that we were in recently that was related to Al-Shabaab. But then eventually when they saw that we were American, they just figured like, hey, we can get some money out of these kids. So they took us to an ATM the next day. We barely slept, and we were in separate cars at that time. So my friend, Peter, got out of the car and went to the ATM, and I was in the other car, and when the driver told me to get out and go to the ATM, I just like slipped into a shop and asked the woman behind the desk at the register if she could call the embassy, because they'd taken our cell phones and not allowed us to call the embassy. And it was a big scene. The cops figured out where I was quickly, and they came in and pulled me out into the sort of like parking lot area by my dress, ripped my dress apart, tried to force us to go back with them, but we refused. And then the embassy came, and it was very professional after that. But I mean, I really think that this story, even though it sounds nuts, it really shows that we need to get more legitimate sources of capital into places like Kenya. Because if you're a cop in a place like Kenya, you take the job with the assumption that you're going to get a supplementary income from bribes, you know? So, you know, this can help provide a cultural shift, hopefully, so that corruption in places like Kenya can be reduced. Yeah.
So with that,
Take questions?
yeah, we can take questions. Otherwise, I do have one like fun question.
Keep going. You've got time.
Okay, great. First then, when I was in Bangladesh, I kind of saw the same thing. When I was in Bangladesh, we were in a rural community, and it was kind of like very unstable political. The military normally runs elections in the first time that it happened in 3 years, so people are going around and literally knifing other people that weren't of the same political party. So, but we saw that the areas that were had instituted microfinance successfully, the crime rates dramatically dropped because of alternative forms of income. But the films that were made around the area that I worked in, it seemed like it was very drawn out. People really wanted the Hollywood version, so they took the most extreme examples. And what I like about the microlending film project that you did is that the case studies seem very real. I'm wondering, like, how did you choose those, and why did you do that?
Sure, yeah. So the documentary that I made preceding launching Seeds, the microlending film project, which you guys should check out in the fall in New York. Like I said, we shot on 4 continents, and I tried to find women that interacted with microfinance in different ways in different locations. So our first shooting location was in Paraguay in South America, and that was sort of a stock microfinance story in which a woman had 9 children. She was Catholic. Her youngest son had a tumor on his abdomen. They thought he wasn't going to make it, but he managed to survive. They spent all their money covering his medical expenses. So she was like, what are we going to do? So she took out a microloan, $60 with 14 other women. So her portion was $4. And she started a business selling cakes in front of her house, sugarcane cakes, because they were sugarcane farmers. And she managed to keep the family afloat. So it was like inspiring. But if you have an awareness of microfinance, that's sort of the type of story that you hear. Whereas whenever we filmed in India, you know, I was working with this woman who had been India's first female Air Force pilot, and there'd been this mandatory, arbitrary retirement for women after 15 years of service, even though you weren't eligible for pension to receive your pension until you'd served for 20 years. So she fought it in Delhi's high courts, and it took her 7 years to win this battle. But she'd already started running her own microfinance organization. So she, even though the IAF invited her to return to service, to active duty, she told them no because she was already making microloans. So without, spoiling the whole movie for you guys. And then in Kenya, it's a tech story. The woman that we followed was the same age as me at the time, 27, and she took out a microloan to open up these M-Pesa shops. So she was essentially a human ATM. People would come in and text message her money, and she would give them cash, or vice versa. She had 4 shops, I think, and was much wealthier than I was at the time. And she was, working in Kenya. And then the last location we filmed in was Detroit, which is an awesome city. Melissa and I actually just touched on this before because this idea that most people are going to be freelancers, or 40% of workers are going to be freelancers by 2020 or whatever it is. I think that people are going to start moving back to places like Detroit. And there's a really cool arts culture happening there. But anyway, the story we told about microfinance in Detroit was a story of how this can help sort of like urban areas that have gone through hard times kind of reinvent themselves. So it's more a story about the place.
Detroit is kind of a depressing place. I've been there, and it seems like there's city proper and there's GM that's there. They operate completely separately, and the statistics are just really depressing. You have a 30% graduation rate in the high schools. Unemployment rate is at 20-some%. So I see microfinance being really valuable in those areas, but at its core, it's very small loans given to women, and the story you tell kind of adheres to that principle, but as it spreads, I've seen it also been implemented in Iowa with farmers. It doesn't really fit that. It doesn't really fit that model, and as Kiva does expand throughout the whole entire world, pretty much, you can't implement the same model across all these different cultures.
Right.
And you're expanding seeds. I mean, you don't just want to be in Nairobi, correct?
Right. Yeah.
So how are you changing the model to implement in these different cultures?
That's an awesome question because it's different. It's very different depending on where you are. I mean, in the States, for instance, we're such a individualized culture that a group microloan just isn't going to work here. I'm not going to take out a loan with my mom and my sister. They wouldn't sign for a loan with me, I don't think. So here, it's more individual loans that are crowdfunded through platforms like Kiva, and they're a little bit bigger, $2,000, $2,500, whereas literally it's $60, as I said, for 15 women in some places in South America and other places around the world. So as we scale, it's just we'll probably borrow from the Kiva model, and then it's just, what they're doing is working on the microfinance side.
It's kind of ridiculous how successful they are right now.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, you're making a real impact with a small amount of money. It's efficient, and it's also philanthropic. It's awesome, I think.
Well, my research, just being in a rural community, there's an hour away from Dhaka, the implementation was so stark. There were loan sharks, and because of lack of government oversight, people, when they couldn't just default on the loan, they were given certain agriculture, they would be given crops, but then a natural storm would come and wipe everything out, and all of a sudden they don't have enough money and they can't feed themselves or the children, and there's some sort of starvation going around. So it's, I mean, how can you implement these in these different countries?
Yeah, it's a great question. The group lending model, I guess I could talk about that. That works, and that if you're familiar with Muhammad Yunus, who's a Nobel laureate who won a Nobel Prize in 2006 because of his work in microfinance. He's Bangladeshi, which is why John, I think, headed to Bangladesh, or part of the reason. So he would give loans to groups of 5 to 15 women because they couldn't access capital any other way, and they didn't have any collateral, so they would self-select the group. So if I wanted a loan again and I was in Bangladesh, I'd reach out to my female friends and relatives to take the loan out with me, and it'd be a joint liability loan. And the peer pressure that these women felt, and not wanting to let their friends and relatives down, it worked. It allowed them to keep the repayment rates. The microfinance institutions were able to keep repayment rates very high. Whereas with seeds, because it's all mobile, this might be too technical, but we're scaling something called a vertical group lending model, where because it's all mobile, we want to keep the level of accountability as high as it's been, 98% in a lot of places. So good borrowers can get promoted to seeds loan officer status themselves, with the idea being that then they'll recruit their mom and their sister and their female neighbor to receive loans that they'll then manage, and then it can self-scale, and hopefully the level of accountability will remain as high.
I believe in that.
Yeah.
So before we open up to questions, the last question I have is, if you could trade lives with any fictional character, who would it be?
I'm reading Clash of Kings right now, the second Game of Thrones book, second book in that series. And I was thinking about how it'd be weird to be somebody like Tyrion, because you'd just be in a very different body. Yeah, I don't know. I'd want to be a character with a very different physical presence than I have, because that'd be weird. Yeah, and you think about how much that affects your experience of the world, like just whatever your physical presence is. Yeah, I don't know. So that's my answer.
All right, awesome. Thank you.
Cool. So does anybody have any questions? We've got time for a few questions. Does anybody want to ask Rachel any questions about microfinance?
Just curious, it seems to be only women get loans. Why is that?
Why is it? Yeah, I'll share a depressing statistic with you. Sorry.
We just need to repeat the question so it gets on film, and he's asking why only women get loans? Is that what it is? Okay.
So actually, men get loans in many places as well. Initially, the idea was that they would focus on women, firstly because these women didn't have access to, or were more likely to not have access to capital. And secondly, there's this terrible statistic about, this isn't a statistic because there's no number, but yeah, men in developing countries with a certain level of education were more likely to spend capital that they were lent on alcohol, tobacco, and prostitutes, whereas women were more likely to invest in better nutrition and education for the family. So from a macroeconomic standpoint, it was just giving to women was better for the economy.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know, I don't farm bill, don't play games, none of that. So I'm just curious, maybe everybody else knows this, but the API is like a little ad in the game. Is that what embedding?
So, well, explain what API is, what you're doing to the game. What are you embedding in the game?
And part two of that is, does the gaming game, if I was to go on there and I'm playing the game and I want to invest in this micro thing, does the game get money? How does that, the person, the end result is the person gets a loan in Kenya, but what portion of that and what goes to, I mean, how does that break down?
So basically it's how does that break down? How does that loan get to the person in Kenya, and how does that money transfer work?
Yeah.
Sure. So first of all, yeah, the API isn't an ad, although later on we might experiment with ads, monetizing in that way. The idea is to make it as seamless as possible. So again, in this example where you're monetizing in patience, rather than paying money into the game to immediately complete a floor in the tower that you're building for your seedlings, you could choose to make a microloan to a certain type of business to instantly complete that floor. So yeah, monetizing in patience and embedding microlending in that monetization of patience. In terms of the money transfer, so it's, yeah, you're putting money into the game, and the money just goes through a very sort of basic international money transfer system that involves like PayPal, Western Union, and M-Pesa, because M-Pesa has a partnership with Western Union. So it goes directly to a cell phone that we have, our loan officer in Kenya is carrying, that's in the seed's name. And she then disperses the loans directly to the cell phones of borrowers. And 100% of the loans are going to the borrowers. We make money, and money goes back to the gaming companies as the loans are repaid. Does that answer your question?
As the loan is repaid.
Right, yeah.
So that's interesting. So it's actually going to this one cell phone that is sort of the sort of central bank cell phone.
Right, for now at
Yeah.
least. As we scale, it'll be
Wow.
different.
And it's been very free of corruption because we're very good at
Due diligence? I'd like to think that. I mean, we've repayment rates for us so far have been 100%, but we've just sort of done a small batch. We're also partnering with microfinance organizations on the ground that are already successful and already doing their own due diligence on the loans. So we can kind of outsource that practice, but then that obviously makes the profit margin smaller. And I'd also like to say that for some reason I think we as a culture have developed this idea that you can't make money and also have a large impact in the social good space. But I'm like, part of my mission is just dispelling that myth, because I really feel that making this for profit, it makes it sustainable, it makes it more efficient, and we can do a lot more to help people. So we're sort of like proudly for profit, very for profit. But people assume that we're nonprofit all the time, and I think it's just because of that way of thinking. Yeah.
And kind of jumping on that question, so the game player pays real money as a microloan. Do you receive your loan payment back in real money or money to spend on the game?
Good question.
So let's just repeat that. So we have somebody who's asking, is the money, since we're all talking about virtual money, is this money, real money being paid to the person? Are you getting real money back?
Sure. Yeah, so it can function different ways depending on the game we're embedding the API in. But the core idea is that you're someone who's putting money into the system purchases virtual currency with real currency, obviously, and then they elect to use the virtual currency to do different things within the game, one of which can be making a microloan. And then when the loan is repaid, and we had a couple of focus groups here in New York just to make sure no one felt like this was, like we were stepping on anyone's toes. We made sure that it was okay with the gamers to have the loans repaid in virtual currency that could then be reimbursed for other things. So for example, we're speaking with American Airlines, not to like overstate the potential of this partnership, but we're speaking with them about allowing users to redeem a virtual currency, the virtual currency that's